Well, today we were excited to have Dr. Stephen Argue with us, and he is a professor of youth ministry and researcher and many other things out at Fuller Youth Institute. So we want to welcome him into this webinar today. And we have a great listing of webinars that are available out on our website, and this will also be recorded and shared through our podcast. And so, tell us a little bit about what you do there at Fuller.
Yeah, it's great. Hey, it's just great to be on this webinar. I've looked at some of the other ones that you've done, and you've got quite a great resource going here. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing to resource youth pastors. And, I don't know, but I mean, sometimes I think youth pastors can just feel pretty lonely, even if they're in a staff situation that's good or whatever. There's something about connecting with other youth pastors that is significant, and I think very settling at times. So I just kudos to you for doing this resource, and I hope that people really take advantage of it. I have been a youth pastor in a couple of different places, and so for those of you that are listening in on this and part of this conversation, I have tremendous empathy and respect for the work that you do in ministry. It's not easy, and especially working with young people, you have my deepest gratitude. I think that those who are youth pastors have a certain wiring about them, a certain bent, a certain craziness that makes us incredibly passionate about caring and advocating for young people. And this world needs more of you in it. And so thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the ways that you stand in those spaces with young people. It takes a lot of guts, and there's just a lot of adults that really don't know how or are afraid to do it. And so I have a deep respect for that. And which is why I do the work that I do. I'm the associate professor of youth, family, and culture here at the Fuller Theological Seminary. And then I'm also applied research strategist at the Fuller Youth Institute. So I get to teach on youth ministry, and then I also get to work with the great folks in the Fuller Youth Institute, where our goal is to do research and turn it into resources. Any way that we can do that to really serve the local church is what we are definitely about. And so we're thrilled to do things like this, because in the end of the day, these are the conversations that not only I hope help churches and church leaders and youth pastors, but I find that a lot of times the questions that come back to us really inform and shape our own questions and research as we move forward. So I think that's the beauty of the Fuller Youth Institute, is that we're in constant dialogue with the church, trying to do our best to partner with you so that we can together make a difference for the next generation. So we're pretty excited about that.
Well, thank you for that. And it's been great to see the resources that you all have produced. And we have utilized them in trainings that we've done throughout our conference. Sticky Faith was such a phenomenal resource to utilize. And then the other resources that came from that. So the small group work that came with that, the parents work that came with that. And then of course, Growing Young has been a very phenomenal set of research that really helped. I would say one thing it did was it really affirmed the smaller church ministries that were happening, because from a lot of times the youth workers that I worked with or the small churches that I worked with, because we have quite a few in our conference, they felt like their youth ministry needed to look like the large church down the street, which often did hire somebody that was young and hip and cool, right?
Right.
But your research affirmed that they didn't have to be that way. That they could be who they are, and who God has placed them to be, and so on. And so I'm excited about now moving from and layering on top of Growing Young with this Growing With research and book that's coming out. So, and it's not been released yet, right? Or it's getting ready to be released?
Yeah, it releases next Tuesday, so March 5th. So we're pretty excited about that release. And like you said, I mean, Brad, you just did a great job describing what we're doing. I mean, as these different pieces have come out, they've come out of our research. And in any good research, what usually happens is you're sort of going after certain questions that you're trying to answer. And then what it does is it raises more questions for more research for us to answer. And so this is like an ongoing trajectory that we're trying to be committed to with the work that we're doing. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to share a little bit about growing young and then a little bit about growing with all of you. So whenever you're ready, I'll dive into that.
Yeah, let's go. And
okay.
And again, if you have questions that you would like to ask of Steve along the way, then we can ask those at some point along this time. He'll give us some time to do that. If not, you can type them in the chat bar area. And then also, if you have questions afterwards, maybe you're listening to this podcast or maybe you're watching this webinar on the recorded video, we'll have up on the screen where you can send those questions to, so that we can make sure that they get answered. So, but Stephen, thank you for being with us again, and go ahead and hit it with us here. So tell us about growing young and with.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let me start out with a little introduction, and then I've got, I do have a keynote for you, and I'll put that up in a second. So I think one of the challenges that we have as youth leaders, especially as youth pastors, is we have this delicate balance and position that we have to hold, and that is we are committed to young people. We want to be there for them, and that's expressed through programming and leadership and discipleship and training of volunteers and all that comes with that. But typically, we also have a bunch of adults that are orbiting around us as well, right? I mean, we know, if you know anything about youth ministry, it's not just about the young people. It's about families, it's about parents, and it's also about our church leadership as well. And what we've discovered is that, and you've discovered this too, that everybody has an opinion about youth ministry. What should be done? What programs work? You've probably heard things like, when I was in youth ministry, this really worked. I mean, if you really went back and did the dunk tank, I really think that could really, really help, right? And you nod and everything else. And, everybody means well, but I think that we have a challenge, and that is that we have a challenge to continue to not only serve young people, but to educate adults and leaders as to what is going on in the youth ministry world, what's happening with young people. And you, in many ways, are the experts in that, because you're living and breathing it all the time. So I spend a lot of my time now, as I work with ministry leaders and youth ministry leaders, is to reframe the narrative as to what's actually going on with young people today. Because if our narrative is off, the solutions that we look for are going to be off as well. So the more that we can understand what's really happening, we're going to have a better sense and a better data point by which to think about the way that we are responding, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through 3 movements today. The first movement is I just want to talk really generally and theoretically about what we mean by adolescence and emerging adulthood. And then I'm going to talk briefly about growing young and some of the research that came out from that, and point you to some great resources. And then I'm going to talk to you about growing with and some of the things that are coming out with that. And I hope that maybe these are great launching pads for you as you're thinking about the work that you're doing. Okay, so now here's the awkward transition where I have to somehow share my screen. So here we go. Hang on. That wasn't too bad, was it? Was that all right? All right, so here we are. I want to talk about this idea of growing young and growing with, and what does it mean for us to serve young people and also their parents and the churches that we think that young people and families really need. So again, here's the theoretical part. Just make sure that we understand some things. A lot of times I think we just have to understand about how we use our terms. And this is where a lot of the misunderstanding happens with parents and with other adults as well. A lot of terms are thrown around. And so very briefly, you all know this, but when we think about this idea of adolescence, a great way to remember this, and this has been used by other theorists as well, is to think about adolescence as beginning with biology and ending with culture. beginning with biology and ending with culture. Now, when we think about it in that way, we often can think of maybe in the past of adolescence being sort of the teenage years, right? Where sometime around 13, kids move from being kids to moving to puberty. And so there's the biology. And so their bodies are changing. And then it ends with culture. And that's usually when society says, you are an adult. Congratulations. We call you an adult. We see you as an adult. You have opportunities as an adult. And so in oftentimes in generations past, I think we've said, well, adolescence is basically that, basically 13 to 18. This also drove the way we think about youth ministry. It's oftentimes sort of considered a transition sort of ministry, right? You're sort of holding on for dear life that young people will make it through this transition called adolescence and somehow make it to the other side with as little scrapes and bruises as possible. That's oftentimes the expectation that parents and adults put on youth pastors, right? Now, what we're realizing is this, though, is that when we use this terminology of adolescence beginning with biology and ending with culture, we're recognizing that biologically, young people are entering into puberty earlier. Some would say age 10. Some would even say even earlier for females, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But we're seeing adolescence start earlier, okay? So this is raising new questions for parents and ministries as to how do we address what's happening with young people and the onset of adolescence earlier. And at the same time, we're also seeing that if adolescence begins with biology and ends with culture, we're seeing through some research that if you were to ask an adult, when does a person become an adult in our society, they'll say 26, 27, 28, 29 years old. So let's just keep the math easy and say that it's up to 30. So now all of a sudden, if we use this definition of adolescence, beginning with biology and ending with culture, we recognize the fact that we're talking about a period of 10 to 30, 2 decades. This isn't a transition anymore. This is like the most important and major time in a young person's life where they are making decisions that oftentimes set their trajectory for the rest of your life. Their lives, right? So this is the point where you take the slide, you screenshot it, you take it to your senior pastor and you ask for a raise, okay? This is like serious. You're welcome, okay?
Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything I can do to help. So if we were to call adolescence 10 to 30, though, we would kind of say that's ridiculous, right? There's something drastically different about a 27-year-old female and a 13-year-old boy, right? So how can we think about this? Well, we know that what's been coined really since about early 2000s is what Jeffrey Arnett calls emerging adulthood. You've probably heard this before. Arnett comes along and says, really emerging adulthood is something different than adolescence. It's actually something that young people feel when they're in between adolescence and they don't feel quite like adults yet. And so he would argue that that is about ages 18 to 29. And again, we'll just say 30 to round it up. And there's something unique about this phase because at 18, something changes. The typical teenager, and I'm being very generic at this point, the typical teenager is living under the roof of a legal guardian parent up to 18, but then at 18, and they're going to high school, they're required, et cetera, it's by law, et cetera, et cetera. But at 18, something happens. The world of a young person opens up. What they do after high school is legion. They could go to a school, they could go to technical school, they could get a job, they could get married, they can vote, they can travel, they can serve. There's 100 things that they can do. So there's this new opportunity that's opened up for them. And all of a sudden we see that the experiences of young people become much more diverse and express themselves in different ways. As leaders, I think we just need to pay attention to that. And a little side note, I'll tip my hand a little bit. The idea that somehow we can do a one-size-fits-all ministry for those 18 to 30 is just really not possible. Because we're finding that as much as this is an interesting phase, it's also one that is diverse and complex, and there's just no silver bullet for finding the one that's going to fit for that. So this is the challenge that we have as we think about those who are older and at the same time need support because they're not recognized as adults yet, and quite frankly, they don't feel that way either. Now, let's just make sure that we understand our terminology a little bit more. You probably have heard, especially older adults, always talk about millennials, and usually it's with a roll of the eye, right? They're blamed for the fact that there's no more office life, that the housing market has crashed, and there are no more avocados anymore in the world, because there's sort of this idea that when you say millennial, there's something negative about it. Millennial has almost the feeling of other, different than me, not me, right? And so when we talk about millennial, or when others talk about millennial, a lot of times they're thinking about generally young people. But what's interesting is this, is that millennial is a sociological term, while emerging adulthood is a developmental term, like adolescence is to emerging adulthood. Millennial is a sociological term, and this cohort is born in a particular period of time, 1980 to about 2000, and they are growing older with time. So right now, millennials are 19 to 39 years old. So if you really want to be snarky and someone says and starts complaining about millennials, say something like, yes, those 39-year-olds are so annoying, and see what kind of response you get from them. They're getting older. And so this is interesting. Millennials are parents. Millennials are in pushing 40 at this point, right? And we know that behind the millennial is what's called iGen or Gen Z. It depends on what researcher you're following, and this is still sort of happening. But they're right now basically ages 7 to 20 to 7, 19, 7, 20, 7 to 24. It depends on, there's sort of a debate as to the upper end of it. So, but what we can say is this, is that basically iGen is either entering college or is graduating from college. And so again, this cohort is going to continue to grow as well. So it's interesting as leaders for us to take this into account. Is there something valuable about calling someone a millennial or an iGen? Yes, in that it defines when a young person is growing up. When a person grows up is significant because it's different for every generation. And at the same time, it's important for us to have a developmental lens and recognize the fact that no matter what happens with the sociological term, there is an expression of adolescence, and now there seems to be an expression of emerging adulthood that falls in these age ranges of basically 10 to 18 for adolescence and then 18 to 30 for emerging adulthood. So it's just great. It's important for us to keep these definitions along the way. So
that's really important stuff, because I think a lot of folks are, people will say, like you said before, that millennials have ruined the church, or the millennials have left the church, or whatever. And it's, no, actually, if you've got children, most likely in your church, most likely their parents are millennials. There's just been this sort of like, millennials are any kids walking around that are in high school or whatever, and redefining that, letting them know that, they're not, that's not millennials now. So,
I tell my students at seminary here that when we name a cohort like millennial or even emerging adulthood, but when we name millennial, the positive side of that is we're trying to give language to the experience of this particular cohort when they grow up, which is actually really beautiful. I mean, this is why we come up with terms. This is why we do the research on it. We want to understand, but something turns when all of a sudden we use that same term to generalize, or to oppress, or to make fun of, and something happens when all of a sudden millennial goes from a portal for understanding to actually a barrier of oppression. And we can use this, I mean, this can be not just for millennial, this can be about for anything. So, we have to hold these terms with great care and recognize the fact that we're always looking for language to understand, but it never should be something that then turns to actually hurt or oppress or categorize, if you will, because there's a uniqueness in millennials. What kind of millennials? Where did they grow up? What kind of experiences did they have, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's that tension that we constantly have to hold. So I appreciate you pointing that out. So what I hear from parents a lot of times, and I'm sure you've never heard this, but a lot of times they'll say, well, when I was a young person's age, or when I was your age, they'll say that to a young person. And a lot of times I think what's happening there is an older person is trying to find a way to connect with a young person, kind of saying, I was a teenager once too, okay? And there's something at a very base level that is actually endearing to that. The problem is this, is that for most young people, the moment an adult utters, when I was your age, it's not a bridge, it actually is a barrier. Because what a young person thinks is, when you were my age, older person, there was no internet. You had fire drills I go through lockdowns. The world has changed. And for you to say that you were just like me just doesn't feel right. And it does something that actually distances rather than connects. And so I think that as adults, we have to be careful to remember that it's not a matter that adults were teenagers or young adults once, which is totally fine. There is a bit there where we can find some common ground. But I think what's key is it's when they were teenagers that makes all the difference, right? When our generation or my generation grew up as a teenager, the experience, the assumptions, the challenges, the opportunities were completely different than, say, what my daughters are experiencing right now. So we have to recognize that while there might be some similarity, there's a tremendous amount of difference. And so it forces us as adults to step closer to understand, because that's when true empathy will be evoked, and we actually will listen and try to understand the stories of young people rather than just assume that we understand that because we live through that. So I think that's a really, really crucial piece. And so, I think there's a reality for young people today. And, one of the ways that we like to explain this again to parents and adults, and again, use this, is, a lot of times when you think about generations past, there was sort of a linear approach to growing up, right? Someone would go to high school, they perhaps would go and get some sort of education, and then they'll get a job that actually is pretty sustaining, and then that moves to marriage, right? And so you have, and then children, right? So you have this sort of progression that's sort of expected, all right? And what's interesting, though, is that for the typical young person today, it looks more like this, right? Out of high school, there's 100 things that they could do. Maybe they're not ready for college. Maybe they can't afford it yet. Maybe they're in a relationship. Perhaps they're trying to get some sort of experience through an internship because there's really no job available. And so what this does is it creates a very different sort of journey for young people that is oftentimes misunderstood by adults, and quite frankly is misunderstood by the church. Let me go back to that other one for a second. What does this look like? This looks like typical church ministry, right? High school ministry, college singles, people get married, career, then couples, and then like kids ministry, and the cycle goes again, all right? Young people are like, this is our experience, so where do I fit in the church? Right? Now we're talking, right? I mean, the systems and assumptions that we have in our churches sometimes don't recognize the actual existence of young people. So when young people say, I don't feel connected to the church, a lot of church people are like, what do you mean? We love you. We always say you're welcome. But we say that in words, but we actually don't say it in our priorities or the way that we actually are structured as a community. And so this is what I think the young person is grappling with. Is like, well, where do I fit in here if I'm a female graduate student that really loves being single, and the idea of marriage is not something that I aspire to. It may happen sometime, but actually I'm pretty comfortable with who I am, and I want to make a difference in the world through my engineering, right? Like, where's the place for her in our churches today? Those are the type of questions that I think young people are wondering how we are going to ask them. So really quickly, I'm spending a lot of time on the theory, but I think it's important. The emerging adults really have 5 main features. They're really working through some identity exploration, multiple identities. They're much more aware of who they are because of their maturity. And so they're asking questions about, who am I as a male or female? Who am I with regards to my race? My gender, my orientation, my ethnicity, my background, my socioeconomic status. All these things are factoring into who I say that I am. And so this identity exploration is really, really important to them. They feel this sense of instability where the world around them is quite unstable. There's no guarantees, even if one has a college degree, that there'll be a job for them at the end. So there's tremendous amount of instability. And at the same time, there's internal instability as well, where they are still finding their voice. And so there's a tentativeness about who they are or what they're becoming. And so if there's this external instability and an internal instability, this creates a tremendous amount of disorientation for them, which is why, thirdly, they're self-focused. Now, some misinterpret this as being selfish, Like, oh, young people, they just think about themselves all the time. They're always thinking about their things rather than anybody else. Well, that's not what's going on here. Think of it this way. If I'm having a panic attack in the middle of an earthquake, what am I going to do? I'm going to put my feet square. I'm going to look and see how I'm standing, and I'm going to focus on myself because I don't want to fall down. That's being self-focused. That's not being selfish. And that's the experience of a lot of emerging adults today. They feel in between. They don't feel like adolescents and they don't feel like adults yet. And sometimes that's reinforced even in our church context where we don't really know what to do with them. And at the same time, they're faced with unparalleled possibilities. And this is the beautiful part of, I think, these emerging generations is, especially for females, there's just more opportunity. There's more job opportunities. There's more alternatives than just maybe a couple of key predisposed tracks that one needs to be on. And so this is a beautiful opportunity for them. And it also, as you can imagine, creates a little bit of anxiety because now they have more choices to make as they are trying to find their way in a world that requires a lot of preparation along with a lot of opportunity. And then they're also just working through their identity formation really with three main things. Like if there's anything you could focus on, like keep these in mind. They're thinking about beliefs, faith, worldview, whatever you want to call it, like what's sort of driving, what's important to me, how do I pick between two good things, et cetera, et cetera. They're thinking about work, what's my fingerprint on the world, how does it fit with what I want to contribute to this world as I'm discovering who I am, and then this idea of love, like can I see myself within a community or spending my life with life in a partnership with someone? What does that look like? And these are driving questions that they're really trying to get their heads around, especially through the third decade of life. What's interesting is that the markers have changed. I just saw another article on this recently today that, an adult, when does an adult feel like an adult? Not when they're married, not when they have a well-paying job. That they might say those things are great, but I don't necessarily feel like an adult. They'd say it's when you take responsibility for yourself, when you make independent decisions, and when you become financially independent. Now, this is really, really interesting because if you think about it, up to about 50% of emerging adults boomerang back home at some point to live with their parents. Now, a generation or two ago, that would seem especially probably in more of, probably like a Euro-American context that really values sort of this independence mindset. Coming back home is like an adulting fail, right? Oh, they moved back home. Oh, I'm really sorry. Oh, right. They couldn't make it in the big world, right? Oh. But what we're finding is that if emerging adults are actually, one of the values that they see as becoming an adult is becoming financially independent. What we're finding is a lot of emerging adults are saying, I'm moving back home because it is the most financially responsible thing for me to do. I'm not going to waste my money on rent when I can live at home, and I'm trying to save up enough money so that I can become independent. So what's interesting is that you have the same activity, but it's interpreted in two different ways depending on the generation. An older generation would see it as an adulting fail, where for a younger generation, perhaps it actually is a step toward adulting. So again, we just need to keep these things in mind and recognize the fact that the behaviors of emerging adults are actually driven by their quest to find this way toward adulthood, but it may look different than previous generations. So really quickly, Jeff Arnett, who coined the phrase emerging adulthood, he'd say, look, it takes time to grow up today. We just recognize the fact that our world is more complex, that becoming an adult in our world has changed dramatically, and it just takes more time. So we need a little bit of grace associated with that and patience with that. And at the same time, Meg Jay, who's a psychologist, would say, look, emerging adults need to recognize that that when they hear the phrase that 30 is the new 20, that does not mean that the 20s are an extension of adolescence. That actually emerging adults must invest this third decade of life well. How am I investing in my relationships? How am I investing in my vocation? How am I investing in my faith? How am I setting myself up so that by the time I'm 30, I'm proud of who I'm developing to be, and I'm on the trajectory to live out the dreams that I feel I have for my life, and that I feel that God has for me. And so what I think is beautiful is this, is that often we hear about churches complaining that young people are leaving the church, but perhaps the church is actually the one organization on earth, one organization in our country that actually is generational and actually cares about young people, that actually could say to young people, look, this is your third decade. This is your decade of investment, and we're a resource for you. We want to be there to help you. I just think if we could stop wringing our hands about young people leaving the church and actually leverage the best of who we are, I think the young people would see and view the church in a completely different way. And this could be a new, just a new wave of hope for young people, and also for the church.
I love that. Say that again, because I think when I work with churches who are saying we're losing our young adults, we're losing them, my question becomes to them, so if they were here, what would you have them do, or where would they be, you know? And they look at me blankly then, and it's like helping them see that that find ways for them to allow them to invest their time into serving, right, into being the church there, as opposed to seeing them as someone that still has to bide their time, like they've been biding their time for the first 30 years, because they were still seen as children or youth or young adults, right? And so at what point do they actually get to have where they can dump their gifts and invest their gifts into the action of the church? So they have to wait another 30 years in order to do it, because that's where most of our leadership is, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is really what's driven some of Growing Young, which I'm going to talk about in a second, Brad. But I think you're exactly right. And I want to tie that to something that you said earlier about smaller churches. This is where I think smaller churches can shine, because I think what we think is, and think about the theory that we've led up to at this point. Remember that for 18 plus, I don't think the answer is college ministry or singles ministry. It's not sort of youth group 2.0. What it is a much more customized approach to understanding the narratives of our emerging adults and leveraging the assets and the resources of our churches to support them. So do you know what they need? They need a student who is getting their teaching degree needs like an older teacher to tell them their story and what it's like to be a teacher and a Christian at the same time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They need like a grandfather to help them understand what it means to be a dad. They need a business leader to just talk to them about, like, if they're in the business, if they're doing their own business, like what that takes, right? We have beautiful stories in our church of people who have been faithful to God and faithful in their lives, that have a story to tell, and young people are longing to hear those stories. They don't want another program. They want a person, right?
They want person, relationship, mentorship. Yeah,
exactly. So this is what I believe as well. And so I think churches can be resources. I think the other thing we have to remember is this, is that there is a narrative out there that says that young people are leaving the church. There is some research that would suggest some of that. But I think that where it breaks down is that we don't really understand why they're leaving the church. It actually isn't out of protest. It actually is more out of ambiguity, and it's not the only narrative. And I love what Emma Green says. She writes for The Atlantic, and honestly, you should just read everything that she writes. I'm a big fan. But she says this, reflecting on this idea of church and young people. She says, the experience of those who are losing the religion shouldn't obscure those who are finding it. And so what we have to remember is that while there might be a narrative of young people maybe not attending church as much for multiple reasons that we've talked about already, there also is another narrative of young people that are actually finding God, that have a deep sense of faith, that are trying to live life with a quality to it, of which God is a part of it and spirituality is important to them. And so one doesn't cancel out the other. all these narratives are moving together. And I think sometimes we only hear the one narrative when actually there's other narratives as well. And so that drives what we do in a lot of our research to kind of say, yeah, there's more than one story here. And how do we tell more of those stories? Which really leads us to growing young. Growing young really came out of this idea of saying, well, where are churches around the country that young people like? Like, what are they doing right? Like, can we learn anything from that? How might we actually do this? And so we did a major research project on this. It was a nationally represented research project where we did online surveys of 259 churches. We did over 500 interviews. We did 12 site visits of all types of churches around the country, which led to over 1,300 interviews, 10,000 research hours, and 10,000 pages of transcripts. Thank you, research assistants. And what we loved is that half the churches were not predominantly white. So we really felt like we had a really good representation of large church, small church, urban expression, rural expression, different backgrounds, race, ethnicity, SES, etc., that really went into this. And really quickly, to say, let me just give you the definition of what growing young is. We're basically saying that these are churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but are growing and involving and retaining young people, which brings overall vitality to the church. That last point is really important, because what we realized was this, is that churches that focused on young people, it wasn't just about only caring about young people. A lot of times this is the critique, like, oh, well, you just don't care about old people. All you want to do is go after the cool kids, right? But what we found is that churches that prioritize young people actually benefited as a whole church, where the overall vitality and investment and connection of everybody seemed to grow. So there was something about thinking and investing in the next generation that benefited everyone, which was something that was rather exciting. Through our work, we found that basically there were 6 priorities that churches seemed to have that were growing young. They prioritized young people everywhere, meaning that they were thought about with regards to the large services, to service, to the ways that they were communicating, to leadership decisions and everything else, and in budgets. There was an instinct to remember that young people weren't just sort of a byproduct, but they were an essential participant and player in their churches. They were also, these churches were the best neighbors. There was a really deep commitment to the ways that they invested in their communities, the ways that they thought about others that were outside the church membership, whoever they might be. And so young people seem to gravitate toward churches that said, my church understands that even though there are people that don't come to my church, that they respect them, love them, hear them, see them, serve them. And then this idea of keychain leadership. And we've used this idea of keychain leadership as kind of like when you hand the young person the keys to the car, right? In that moment, there's more than just something instrumental that's happening. You're actually saying to a young person, I trust you. Here's agency. You are responsible. I see you as being able to handle this, right? And so this idea of giving responsibility to young people rather than holding on to it, Brad, kind of what you said before, about generations having to wait. There's actually this giving away of leadership and influence rather than trying to hold on to it with these churches. A tremendous sense of empathy, of truly understanding the stories of young people rather than making assumptions. And then, surprise, surprise, a deep commitment to Jesus' message. The fact that somehow Jesus' message of the gospel embodies something that's not theoretical, but is something that is tangible and real. It's faith with skin on, right? Like, young people want to know how faith actually works, like today. Like, don't tell me about heaven. That's fine, whatever. I don't need to necessarily understand all atonement theories, though that is important. Theology. But at the end of the day, it comes down to how are we treating our neighbors? How are we loving others? How are we letting this good news actually be a part of our everyday living, relationships, calling, vocation, etc. So that was really important to young people. And then there's this idea of warm relationships. I mean, in the book, we say that warm is the new cool, right? It's not about being a cool church. It's actually about developing and valuing relationships within the church. Which incidentally is really interesting. There's another study on just generational, passing the faith on from generation to generation. And one of the longest longitudinal studies that have been done would say that one of the few connecting pieces of evidence that seem to be there from generation to generation is this idea of warmth. That when a parent relationship with their child is warm, a child is much more apt to actually consider, embrace, and actually hold the faith tradition of their family. If there's a sense of coldness or distance, there's more of a sense to reject it. So this idea of faith is not just an intellectual one. It has this deep emotional and relational element that's really, really important as well. And so obviously this is rooted in Jesus, and then also we see that there's this context as well. And so when churches aren't doing these things, there's the possibility of them growing old, of not being attuned to emerging generations that are a part of their churches. And so this is what we unpack in the research with growing young. I'll just pause there for a second. I don't know if Brad or Jennifer, if you guys want to make any comments on that, but I'm in the interest of time and everything else, I'm gonna keep moving.
Jennifer, anything?
All right. Let's keep it rolling. Okay. Oh, this is great. Great stuff. Here we go. You can do with regards to these 6. Some churches are doing great, and some and others. It's not like it's all bad or all good. There's chances are your church is probably doing pretty well in a few of these, but could do better in others. There's actually a growing young assessment that you can take. And you can buy different bundles where your whole church can take it, which I find really, really helpful, because in our churches, we all have a narrative we tell ourselves about what kind of church we are, about what we're good at, what we're not so good at, et cetera, et cetera. But if you have an assessment where people are taking it, it provides a little bit of objectivity where we can say, hey, this is who we say we are. We're pretty good neighbors, but we're really not as warm of a community as we thought we were, right? If we know those things, then we can begin to make adjustments to develop and grow these things. So now it's no longer a shot in the dark, like, gosh, what should we teach on for this series in the fall? We can actually say, you know what I think we have to work on as a congregation is, one of the characteristics, right? So I highly encourage you to look at this assessment. I think it can be a real great help for churches. And we're having more and more churches and denominations take this. And so we're developing a great base of data with regards to this, as to where churches are getting stuck and what we can do to help. And so this can be a real great resource for you. So wanted to let you know about that. Well, what was also interesting is that as we did Growing Young, we realized that if for a church to grow young, the leadership can do a lot of things, but there's also this crucial relationship that all youth pastors understand that is really, really important, and that is a young person's relationship with their parents. And we realized that out of the research from Growing Young, that there's something unique that's happening with the young person experience that's not only changing young people, but it's actually changing the way parents parent. And so we decided to write this book called Growing With. And this idea of growing with is very, very, really, really significant. The title is important because I think sometimes there's a lot of parenting books that the hidden message is, 10 steps to control your child. Do this and your child will come out this way, right? It's like plug and play. And what we see in these books a lot of times is this distancing of what the parent needs to do, because it's all about fixing the kid. What we're saying with parents of adolescents and emerging adults is actually, as young people are changing and our kids are changing, we're changing too. That the growing that's happening is not just with them, but it's with us as well. And if we're not attuned to that, if we don't pay attention to that, we're actually missing maybe the most important part of our parenting role. And that is recognizing that our parenting role needs to change as well. So really quickly, let me just talk to you about this a little bit. We realize a couple of things with parents at a very, very heartfelt level is that, I think there's just a lot of parents that are grieving, especially in the teenage and adolescent and emerging adult years, where they're all of a sudden realizing that their child isn't who they thought you thought they were going to be, right? There's this frustration, lament, worry that gosh, my kid isn't who I thought they were going to turn out. And so there's this crisis that happens with parents sometimes that I know if you're a youth pastor, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a sort of a panic that sort of comes with that. And I think the other panic is that they find that their relationship with their child isn't what they thought it was going to be. They a lot of times reminisce to these earlier times when, gosh, my kid used to love to be with me. Now they never want to talk with me. My kid used to search me out, and now I never know where they are. We used to spend hours together, and now whenever we interact, it's always a fight, right? I mean, these are the deep, profound laments that parents have, and they don't know what to do with it. And so sometimes they dump on youth pastors, really honestly. They want you to come up with a perfect program that's going to somehow fix this angst that they feel. But it's actually something much deeper. And, this is something that we wanted to address. And so, maybe this is just a question we won't answer it now, but something just to keep in mind, as you think about your own context, what sorts of disappointments do you suspect that parents and teenagers and young adults that are dealing with? I'm sure that you all can tell stories about that. And I think that what we need to do as pastors is have sort of a spidey sense of what's going on there, because these are deep longings that parents have. And so maybe what we need to do is just sort of be honest about the changes that young people are experiencing, and be honest about the changes that our families are experiencing. And maybe in our faith communities, we could do a better job to really view change in our families and in our young people as the norm rather than the exception, right? Like, why are we surprised that young people are changing? Like, that's what they do, right? I mean, and that's what families are doing as well. And so I think that to own the fact that we're in process can maybe make a difference in the ways that we think about that. And, I think that for me as a parent, and Kara Powell, who I wrote the book with as a parent, I think we just recognize the fact that it's hard being a parent. When I was a younger youth pastor, I would do these killer parenting seminars. We all love them, right? And they were so good. Oh my gosh. I mean, I put my heart and soul into them. But there was always that parent that was like in the back of the room, right? That kind of orbits the back of the room, and they're waiting for a time to talk with you as you're cleaning up. And I can also tell that they're debating with themselves, like whether or not they want to talk to me or not. And I think my younger youth pastor self would be like, why didn't you raise your hand during the Q&A session? Like, I'm ready to go home. Like, I don't really want to talk to you right now, right? But now as a parent of teenagers and emerging adults, I'm realizing that when that parent comes up to you, that is a sacred moment. And they're, with everything that they've got in them, with eyes that are wet, they're saying to you, I'm not well. My kid is struggling. I don't know what to do. And I am ashamed, and I am hurting, and I love my kid, and I'm freaking out, right? I mean, this is where a lot of parents are at. But I'll tell you something. Usually in church settings, that's usually done in the down low. It's in the secret conversations, because we don't, as parents, want anybody else to know that we don't ever act together. Like, it's really hard for us. We don't want to believe that there's something wrong with our kid, or we think that our kid is the only one that's going through problems. These are like the constant challenges that we have as parents. And so how do we create an environment where we can bring this more out into the open, where we can help parents have like real conversations about the changes that are happening in their kids' lives and in their own lives? And how can we do that? Because if we could actually have like an honest conversation, an open conversation, maybe we could actually like turn the dial, right? I mean, maybe we can actually change the course of some things. Maybe there's like these new opportunities that are out there, not only for our young people, but for their families as well. That's really our hope. And so this is really one of the reasons that we wrote Growing With. What Karen and I love to tell youth pastors especially is like, in the end of the day, parents trust you. You love their kids. You're there for them. they're going to come to you before they're going to come to anybody else. They're not going to come to the experts because they don't know us, right? And so parents trust you. And what I have found when I was a youth pastor is that I was always looking for a resource that I could trust, that would really help me help my parents. And so maybe another way to say it is Karen and I wrote the book that we always wish we had. We want to help youth pastors look good and be resourced and help the parents that they care about. And so this comes from a deep place of us being youth pastors, as researchers, and also as parents. So maybe we're like compassionate researchers that are actually in the trenches with parents and also understand where you're coming from as youth pastors as well. And so we're really excited about this, and we hope that can help. What we find a lot of times with parents is that a lot of times what happens is that parents sort of think like, when my kid grows up, we're going to grow apart. Okay. I'll never forget, I was doing a parenting seminar once for parents of fifth graders, and I can't remember what I did in the seminar. It wasn't that compelling, I'm sure. But I remember one thing I said. I said in the middle of the seminar, I said to the parents, your fifth grader will graduate high school in 7 years. And you could just see the look of horror on these parents' faces. And one mother took her hands and she just instinctively went like this, and I'll never forget that image, because I think parents are afraid of their kids growing up, and they see the innocence, they see the beauty in their kids, and they're so worried that this world won't see how awesome their kids are, and they're going to have setbacks, and the world is cruel at times, and so there's this tremendous fear that often comes with young people, and so they're afraid of that. There's also this resistance. Like, some parents are just like freaking out about like their kids growing up as they're gaining more autonomy and voice and making their own decisions. And so this is where I think you get helicopter parents or drone parents or lawnmower parents. The instinct for the parent is to somehow reduce the risk, to somehow control the situation, because somehow if I can do that, maybe my kid can come out of like this growing up unscathed. And so this doesn't always, as you know, work well with parent-child relationships. And then there are some parents that just kind of accept it. Like, I think I was done about age 12. Like, my kid doesn't really want me around anymore. I don't feel like I have a voice in their life. I don't really know what to do. And so there's this shrugging of the shoulders and thinking that I think there's no more I can really do. And so there's this passive giving up that some parents have because they honestly just don't know what to do. And, wouldn't it be great if the church could step in and say, look, it's not the end of your parenting. As a matter of fact, it's just a new chapter. And then we can do more than grow apart. We can actually grow with our kids. And so really briefly, let me just give you, with my time remaining, just sort of a framing of what we're trying to think about with this. Growing with, the way we're defining it is this. It's a mutual journey of intentional growth for both parents and children that trust God to transform us all. It's a mutual journey. We're doing this together of intentional growth. We have to actually think about the moves that we're making. The parenting that I did yesterday doesn't work with the parenting that I need, the parenting my kids need today, right? It's for both parents and children that trust God to transform us all. And so let me keep going. Do questions at the end. We've divided adolescence and emerging adulthood, that theory that I gave you before, really in 3 categories. We're saying that really ages 13 to 18 is what we're calling learners. As you know, the high school years, and middle school and high school, they're just sponges, right? They're learning who they are physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, intellectually. And so this is where they're in life. And so there's a bit of naivete because things are new to them and the world is interesting and growing more diverse. But somewhere around the ages 18 and 23, and you can see the circles overlap because this isn't a hard and fast age period, we're saying that they move from learners to explorers. And this is where they really are moving away from sort of the high school experience, and they're launching off into a world with tremendous opportunities, but they're also feeling a bit unsure about themselves, right? So there's excitement and there's also apprehension. And so explorers are beginning to test the waters as to who they want to be and the trajectories in their lives. And then you have focusers, which is really probably ages 23 to 29. These are young people that are moving much more closely to adulthood. They've made decisions along the way, for better or for worse, that have them where they are right now. It doesn't mean that they can't jump to a different trajectory, but oftentimes focusers are really feeling the effects of the good choices that they've made and the opportunities that are now in front of them, and the poor choices they've made that is actually holding them back. Focusers have much more better sense of who they are, and at the same time, I think that the majority of focusers that I talk with will all say that they feel behind in some aspect of their life. Now, if this is the way that we could think about young people, learners, explorers, and focusers, here's the catch. What kind of parent does a learner, explorer, and focuser need? And we're saying this, is that learners need teachers, right? That makes sense, right? The job of the parent for learners is to teach them habits, to show them dedication, to invite them to explore new questions that they have and help them answer those questions, and to develop a pattern for the ways that they're learning. And so we come with a teaching posture, oftentimes leading the way, because learners are still novices in so many aspects of part of life. What explorers need, though, from a parent is not more of a guide. It's less about the parent out front leading, and it's more about a side-to-side relationship. If you're on a hike, there are places where, as a guide, you let the explorer lead the way, right? But then there's going to be some technical terrain that's new to them, where they really need help. And this is where the guide steps in and says, hey, let me lead the way here. So there's much more mutuality that's happening there. And so as a parent, we have to play a different role with our explorers. And then focusers need resourcer parents. They need parents that are not quick to jump in and tell them what to do. That's not where they're at in life. But oftentimes there are crucial moments where focuser needs advice. And they need to know that there's a resourcer parent that's nearby. A resourcer parent may not agree with the trajectory of the focuser, but they still are committed to them in relationship. And that's really what focusers are looking for as well. Now, very, very briefly, think about this for a second. Think about what happens when you have a focuser kid and a parent is trying to treat them like a teacher. What happens there? That's like a helicopter parent, right? Or if you have a learner kid that has a resourcer parent, what do you have there? You have like a distant parent, right? When we cross lines with what a young person needs, the type of parent a young person needs, this is where the sparks fly. This is where the misunderstanding happens. This is where we miss being the best parent that we can be to our young people. And so what Kara and I are trying to say is, as our kids are growing, what is the role that we play in their trajectory, and what can we best do to support them? Okay? Can I keep going? Are we good? I'm on a roll. All right, I give a thumbs up, all right? Okay, so what do we do in these stages, right? I mean, what does this actually mean? I do not have a lot of time for this, and I'm sorry for that because I'm just so excited. But as we think about these three stages, I think what this means is that there's really three verbs that we want to talk about as well. Like there's an action, a dynamic expression that's coming through for a teenager through an emerging adult, through the learner, explorer, focuser phases. And the first one that we call is just this idea of withing. And what we mean by withing is basically this, is that it's a family growth and supporting each other as children grow more independent. As young people are finding their voice and becoming more independent, the dynamic of the family is changing. And so the way that we live together, the way that we in our withing changes because the dynamics in that family are changing. And so it's up to the parent to be aware of the way that we are the way the relationships are changing so that we can best attune to helping them continue to nurture a relationship with them. What's beautiful about withing is like this. If I'm understanding that things are changing as a parent, when I try to help my teenager and they basically shut me down, I learn that I don't need to be offended by that. That's actually them learning to become independent and to take responsibility. And it's at that point that I can actually celebrate the hey, I got this, mom, I got this, dad, rather than be offended that they don't need me anymore, right? So the relationship is changing, and we're attuned to that as parents, and hopefully that helps us as the changing is going on. We also talk about this idea of adulting, and all of you have probably heard this idea of adulting before. We talk about it in two ways. There's relational adulting and vocational adulting. And we say that adulting is our child's growth and agency as they embrace opportunities that shape them in the world around them. Okay, so what we mean by adulting is that they're just becoming more and more aware of the way that they're owning their lives, the friendships they're making, the vocation that they're pursuing. And this affects us as parents in unique ways because it may not be the trajectory that we thought our kids would go. And at the same time, there's a level of respect as we begin to see and understand who they are discovering they are, and the ways that they want to invest their lives in relationships, which affects us because we want to get to know their friends and understand what they're interested in as well. So this idea of adulting takes on different forms from a teenager all the way through emerging adulthood. And again, we can use that to help our young people and our kids along the way. And then there's this idea of faithing. Faithing was, the term was used, Sherry Dallas Parks and a couple other researchers. But basically the way we think about faithing is this, is like a lot of in church circles, we think about this idea of faith, that one has faith or finds faith or loses faith. When we talk about faith that way, it's a noun, it's a thing that we have, right? But as we look into scriptures, we see that faith is more than a noun; it's also a verb. You know, to faith is to believe in, it's to trust in, right? And so we not only have faith, but we faith. And so this idea of faithing allows us to understand that as our young people are growing, their faith is morphing, changing, developing along the way. Now, when we think about it in that way, the beauty is this, is that we recognize the fact that doubt in our spirituality is not an enemy of faith, but it actually is a friend of faith. That part of our faithing experience is to raise questions about the assumptions we have about God, ourselves, and the world, and then recalibrate that as we dig deeper into our understanding of what the gospel is about, and as we encounter new experiences in the world. And so this also affects us as parents as well, because it challenges some of our assumptions. It challenges some of our questions. Sometimes I find that parents are freaking out because their kids are raising questions that they once had but never chose to answer. And so there's something deeply relational about this faith that's there as well. And so we say faithing is owning and embodying our journey with God as we encounter new experiences and information. So this is, I think, really important for churches, as you can imagine. We don't have a lot of time to talk about that, Brad. We might have to just have another whole little chat on that. But that is sort of the basic ideas of what's happening with that model. So I'll just stop there really quick. I don't know if you want to entertain any questions with regards to that. I've just got a couple more slides, more about some resources, but I wanted to give you a snapshot into this book that's coming out this next week.
Wow. That's some great stuff. I am seeing more and more in resourcing and research and actually in conversation, the need to really start thinking about not just youth ministry like we've been talking about, but the whole family, you know. I have an operational team that helps me think about the ministry for Next Gen Discipleship for the Tennessee Conference. And from the very beginning, when we were talking about what would our mission be, it was about basically we settled in on this phrase of not cradle to grave, but birth to glory. Like, how are we talking about holistic discipleship? How are we developing children? Because it starts with children's ministry for us, but also their parents to be, you know, because we all the research shows that children and youth are going to model what they see, right? Yeah. And so this work that you guys have created, again, as you said, I would have liked to have had it back when I started in youth ministry. Actually, back when I started teaching, 30 years ago as a teacher in a middle school, because I think that's where we hurt in education too. Get a little bit on my public education soapbox a little bit, that we need parents to understand this about their students as well, right? Like how are they engaged in their students' education, not just about faith, but also about school, their whole development.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that some of the tension that Kara and I had when we wrote the book too is, there is an element of empathy where parents already feel piled on. I mean, a parent never feels like they're doing anything right. The next article comes out, the next book comes out that says, oh, here's 10 more things that you need to do that you're not doing, and that type of thing. And I think what we tried to do in this book is, have some really good research because we wanted this to be reliable. But we also give examples of just some first steps that a parent can take. Because here's the good news. We really believe that it's never too early and it's never too late for a parent to grow with their kids and to take a step toward them. And some of the research would even suggest that for an emerging adult and their relationship with their parents, that the majority of relationships between an emerging adult and a parent actually get better. So if you had a good relationship with your teenager, it can get better. If you had a bad relationship, like it was just rough and rocky with your teenager as a parent, there's a chance to hit the reset button and actually have a better relationship. And I don't know about you, but you tell that to a parent and you will be their hero, because I think some think once I've blown it, that's it. We don't want to communicate that. I mean, this is great news, right? I mean, if we could say there's always hope, there's always a chance to make it a little better. Man, parents they kind of need to know that there's still hope, because you know what? They love their kids. They really do, and it's hard. Parenting's hard. Life's hard. Right. So, I think you're absolutely right. And, that's why what the work that you all do is so important, right? I mean, truly, I keep saying that, but it's true. I mean, you see,
and I think it also, from what I've heard too, that it reinforces that part for us to say parents are important, family systems are important, because I think we can also get bought into the idea that because we're we, as you said in the beginning about us being just passionately caring for young people, like we're just a different breed, right? Like we want to be there, and sometimes that can generate arrogance in us to believe that we're the only ones that can do that, right? Yeah. And what I'm trying, what I'm hearing in this, and what I'm trying to articulate is that I think the youth minister has to be a connector for parents back to their children in some ways, right? They have to share this information.
Yeah, I think so. And, I mean, you're exactly right. I think if we just keep the parent in mind as we do ministry, I think that we won't leave them behind. I think we'll keep from surprising them, and maybe we can even help them along the way. I think sometimes I've been guilty as a youth pastor of always setting that bar so high for parents, but then not giving them any resources to get there. And maybe this is one way I'm making up for that by, writing this book with Kara and kind of saying, no, I actually think this book can give a vision for parenting, but we want to help you with that along the way. And maybe really quick, let me just show you this. I'm going to skip that. The book you can order. You can actually pre-order it, and if you pre-order it before the launch date on March 5th, you actually get all this like really cool free stuff. You get like a parent. There's a master class with Kara and me. You get an audio of the book. You get navigating our digital world in a digital form. And then we actually have some really cool podcasts that we've done with some other parents as well, from different races and backgrounds and ethnicities, really talking about their parenting experiences as well. So, we just want to make that available to you all if you pre-order. And then also, and anybody can do this, but if you go to the growingwithbook.com, there's also a parenting quiz that we've put together where parents can actually, it's really short, it's 10 questions, but it actually asks them questions about how they feel about their kids, how they feel about their parenting, and it will then spin out a resource page that says, hey, this is where your kid's at. They're a learner, explorer, focuser. This is the type of parent they need. There's a video there of Kara and me, and then some other tips and tricks there along the way. So it's a real easy way to just point your parents towards some helpful resources, because we're really want to be committed to that. So wanted to let you know about that too. So,
great stuff.
yeah.
I don't want to maximize it all. Do you have anything you want to ask her? You're muted. She's getting unmuted there. There she goes.
Yeah, sorry, my mouse wasn't working. No, I just have been really appreciating this. You know, I I get the opportunity this summer at our I work for a parachurch organization, and I get an opportunity to share a workshop on teaching adults how to listen to the youth, to the children. So the beginning of this was so good. But as a parent of a 10-year-old, and you know, just having a resource not only for me to use to help assist parents as I minister to them with their youth and even with their young adults, but then also as a parent who's about to walk into all of this and about to walk into adolescence and this whole process. It's not gonna lie, it's freaking me out a little bit. So
we're in there with you.
All right. Awesome. But that's what I'm excited about, is, you know, just getting to this opportunity. And there's just so many good things. And I'm like, oh, this is a really good point to utilize when I teach this. And this helps me think about it in a different way. So thank you.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad it was helpful. Thanks so much for those kind words. And yeah, go get them. You're gonna do great.
Thank you.
Well, I would say as we close, and so that let me switch here to this gallery view thing. Here we go. I didn't want Jennifer to feel uncomfortable being the only one on the screen, but I think what I've found is I've utilized these resources that Steve's been a part of creating, is that they are practical. Because they are based in real data. You know, there are cohorts of churches that are going through some of these same things with you all. So you've got a test group that's practicing these things while you're also sharing these things. I know we have a church, I think Providence United Methodist out in Mount Juliet, I think, is a part of one of your cohorts right now, I believe. Pierce Drake, I don't know if you've met him, but I think that's the thing, that all of us are looking for something different. But I think what it is that we're looking for things that that will actually help move the bar differently. It's not that we're trying to recreate anything. We're just, what I think, it's like you said, we want the real meat. You know, we've been eating the ice cream a lot, you know, and doing all the fun stuff and everything else like that. And like you said, adding the bounce house or the dunk tank or whatever. And there's so much of that out there that kids want. They want their faith to be developed in a way and have access in a way different than what we did.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's just taking young people seriously and also taking their families seriously. And I'm grateful for the great work you're all doing. And I know we have a lot of UMC churches that have been part of our cohort. So we're really grateful for just what you're doing, not only individually, but as a denomination. So keep up the good work. And it's been great to spend this time with you.
Thank you all very much.